Good morning, good evening, or good day. My name is Nadia McConnell. I'm president of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and welcome to the Ukraine in Washington and Beyond Conference and Expo. Let me just also cover a few more administrative instructions. You saw already how to choose the language of your preference. Just remind you that if you want to listen just to your preferred language, be sure to unmute the original, or if you're interested in listening to both, you can leave it on, and so you'll hear both the English and the Ukrainian. Also, I remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A chat room. And also, I encourage you all to use the chat rooms for networking purposes. There is no way that we could put on these kinds of events without the support of many people. Of course, first and foremost, our sponsors. So thank you to our sponsors. And also equally as important, though, are our informational partners that have been helping us with this conference. And a special shout out to Ukraine Invest, the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, and American Chamber of Commerce, who helped us in organizing some of the program for us during these next 3 days. The U.S.-Ukraine Foundation is celebrating its 30th anniversary working in Ukraine. Our mission has been to promote democracy, a free market economy, and human rights, as well as U.S.-Ukraine relations. We understand, and I trust we all understand, that strong bilateral relations are not sufficient unless they are accompanied by the partnerships on the economic sphere. And that is why we are putting so much emphasis on the business opportunities that people could find in Ukraine, and to promote greater ties between the United States and Ukraine. I also want to thank especially the Embassy of Ukraine for their ongoing cooperation throughout these 30 years. Now it will be my pleasure to introduce the newly arrived ambassador from Ukraine, Her Excellency Oksana Markarova. She has a very distinguished career. She has held leadership positions in both the private sector, NGO, and within government. She has had quite a few busy weeks since her just arrival a few weeks ago. And so it is my pleasure to again welcome the ambassador. Please.
Thank you very much, Pani Nadia, and I would like to thank U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for organizing this event and bringing together such a distinguished group of participants to talk about U.S., Ukraine, but especially with the focus on innovations. As you know, the last 7 years, Ukraine is at the forefront of several battles. One existential battle in the East for sovereignty, territorial integrity against Russian aggression. It's a battle for Ukraine, but it's also a battle for democracy, for our shared European values and international rules. Because sovereign Ukraine, with returned Crimea, the occupied Donbass, prosperous Ukraine, Ukraine as a part of European Union, Ukraine as a part of NATO, is the vision of Ukrainian people. But it's also the necessary element for the security and development of Black Sea region and Europe. And our international partners stand with us, and we're grateful for their efforts, and especially to the United States, our main strategic partner, ally and true friend. And as you rightfully said, the recent visit of Secretary Blinken to Kiev with a delegation once again demonstrated this unwavering support from the United States for this path. And I'm sure we will win in this fight. While we defend Ukraine from aggression, we also are fighting internally in Ukraine for transformation of Ukraine into a modern prosperous state. It's a fight against corruption. It's a fight against oligarchs. It's a fight for efficiency, for better business climate, better governance, for better level playing field for businesses, both Ukrainian and international. It's a fight essentially for equal economic opportunities for all Ukrainian people to participate in the growth for which Ukraine, as we were talking for the past 30 years, is destined for. Because of our natural resources, because of our location, because of well-educated, great people that we have. And I'm positive that even though during the past 7 years, Ukraine has done more reforms than in the previous 13, even though we are now tackling a very important systemic reforms like land reform, governance reform, judicial reform, the key element and the key secret, if I may say so, for our economic success is innovations. Advanced development of science and technology and innovations is the key economic prosperity and national security in the modern world. As we recently, 2 weeks ago, heard President Biden say in Congress, investments in scientific breakthroughs propel us to the future. That's what we completely share in Ukraine. And President Zelensky specifically gave a task to all diplomats to develop economic diplomacy, but also that he expects significant increase of investments and business activity between the US and Ukraine. There is huge untapped potential for our cooperation with the United States in all innovative spheres: IT, biotech, telecommunications, energy, climate, sustainable agriculture, and many other areas which could be unleashed due to better cooperation between our governments, but also cooperation between our business communities. Ukrainian businesses can and should become a driving force for the economic growth. And while Ukraine has this potential to become a powerhouse of innovative product development, opening business could be a huge competitive advantage for Ukrainian, but also for US companies. As you know, the IT industry has grown in Ukraine nearly 40 times over the past 15 years. In 2020, it exceeded $5 billion US and became the third largest export from Ukraine, behind agriculture and mining only. Around 200,000 very capable specialists, well respected around the world, live and work in Ukraine, but they work globally. So our aim is to open Ukraine for American businesses which are not already there, and encourage businesses which are there to pay special attention to innovations. US and Ukraine are divided by 9,000 kilometers, which seems to be a huge distance and the ocean, but we're definitely united by the spirit of innovations and entrepreneurship, as well as our desire for freedom and willingness to fight for it. So we believe that innovations should become the common line that goes through all of our cooperation, and it should propel Ukraine to the future. And our team here at the embassy is ready and to work 24/7 to make our contribution for this to happen. With that, I would like once again to thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference, and I wish you all great discussions. And please know that US Embassy is here to help.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And also thank you for reminding us about really the role of innovation and startups. Our subtitle for this event is Powering Partnerships Through Innovation and Startups, because that is the key in really building the strong relationship between us, Ukraine, as well as Ukraine building it with other countries. And now it'd be my pleasure to invite to speak Ambassador Reeker. Ambassador Reeker has a very distinguished career serving in many parts of the world. He speaks multiple languages. And as we discussed a little bit ago, this is not his trip last week with Secretary Blinken and Undersecretary Nuland was not his first. In fact, I guess his first trip was in 1996, if I recall what you said, with President Clinton. So he knows Ukraine, and we are very grateful that he has agreed to join us, especially after the very important trip that he and Secretary Blinken had taken to Ukraine last week. Ambassador Reeker, please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Good morning, everyone, and particularly good morning to Ambassador Markarova. It's great, Oksana, to welcome you again to Washington. Our team in the Bureau of European Affairs looks forward so much to the intense cooperation and work we do together with your team at the Ukrainian Embassy here in Washington. And good morning to all of the distinguished participants. I want to thank the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for organizing this conference. Indeed, I think the dozens of speakers, many of whom I know well, hundreds of registrants, is really a testament to the robust and bipartisan support for Ukraine here in the United States and here in this town in Washington. I understand Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur will be addressing you tomorrow. And on Thursday, I believe, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. So you've got the executive branch, the legislative branch, very much bipartisan support. And it's certainly an honor for me to be speaking with you today. As you mentioned, it was actually 26 years ago, in 1995, when I first visited Kyiv during the historic visit of President Clinton there. And then just 5 days ago, I had the pleasure of joining our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, for this administration's first face-to-face meetings with President Zelensky. Of course, President Biden had spoken with President Zelensky some weeks ago. The Secretary had an opportunity to meet with Foreign Minister Kuleba also a couple of weeks ago in Brussels on the margins of the NATO-Ukraine Council meeting. In Kyiv last week on Thursday, besides meeting President Zelensky and Prime Minister Shmyhal and the Foreign Minister, we had an opportunity to also meet with promoters of corporate governance, meet, of course, with our embassy, which is one of the largest platforms we have in Europe, involved in so many areas, helping Ukraine. And indeed, coming with us on her very first trip as Undersecretary of State was Toria Nuland, who used to sit in my chair as the Assistant Secretary for Europe. And I think everyone in Ukraine knows her well for her dedication and focus on Ukraine, representing the unwavering support that the United States has for Ukraine. So this trip last week really was a new and revitalized start to our bilateral partnership as we continue to work and be clear that we want to see Ukraine achieve its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. I think, as Ambassador Markarova can attest, the trip was very positive and productive. The Secretary was saying as we left, he wished we could have stayed longer. We'd just come from London, where he was participating in the ministerial meeting of the G7 countries. And of course, the G7 has been very supportive, working together to help Ukraine. The visit, I think, provided an opportunity to convey in person President Biden's message of how much we value the friendship with Ukraine and the partnership, even as we continue to deepen and strengthen and certainly reinvigorate our ties. This administration will continue the U.S. commitment to a prosperous, peaceful, and democratic future for all Ukrainians. And that's something Secretary Blinken very much reiterated in Kyiv. The United States will never waver in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that includes territorial waters. We unequivocally support Ukraine's chosen Euro-Atlantic path. We do this by providing assistance, expertise, and working with allies and partners to push for progress on rule of law, economic and defense reforms that strengthen the independence and transparency of Ukraine's institutions. And we will continue to work with Ukraine to hold accountable those who stand in the way of reforms and those who try to undermine the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. That means supporting Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression, which is not abated, but continues, as we know, in the Donbass. where Russia now controls and perpetuates a conflict that's claimed more than 13,000 lives. Secretary Blinken was able to pay tribute to those lost in that war and the brutal Russian occupation of Crimea. There we see continued abuse of human rights, and they try to punish and suppress any voice of dissent. We also took note of the nefarious activities in the Black Sea region and the Russian disinformation campaigns, which are relentless. It's something we have come to understand, the challenge of hybrid attempts to destabilize Ukraine politically and economically. And so this conference, I think, is very timely in that it will address some of the issues Ukraine is facing in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And we certainly share Ukrainian colleagues' strong concerns over Russia's militarization in Crimea and the Black Sea region. And you've seen as the international community has condemned the military buildup that Russia took, bringing in numbers of troops and equipment at a level unseen since the 2014 invasion. We regard this as a clear threat to regional and international security, and we do work closely with our allies and partners to deter further buildup. I just want to underscore, as Secretary Blinken did in Kyiv, that we will continue to work with Ukraine bilaterally to strengthen, for instance, naval capabilities in the Black Sea. And we look forward to delivering 2 island-class cutters to Ukraine, I believe later this month, in addition to the 2 that we provided back in November of 2019. At that time, I was the civilian deputy commander at US European Command when we planned that. And I moved here into this position back in Washington at the European Bureau, very much in sync between our diplomatic and our military parts of the government to continue supporting whether it's the Maritime Guard and the naval focus of our security assistance. Of course, we're looking forward later this year to supporting Ukraine's launch of the Crimea platform. That'll be in August, coinciding with the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. And it really will be an excellent opportunity to draw international attention to the strategic consequences of Russia's occupation and militarization of Crimea, including the broader impact on Black Sea security. So we are certainly committed to working with Ukraine. We'll be talking to the ambassador and the embassy and other partners to make the Crimea platform a success. I'm also glad to see that so much of the planned conversation over the next days of this conference is focused on the complex issues of energy and encouraging economic development and competition. Regional integration is an important theme, and supporting investment, including from US firms, is obviously something that's going to be vital, particularly as we emerge in the post-COVID economy. When we speak of supporting Ukraine, it is essential to support Ukraine's internal fight against corruption. Secretary Blinken made very clear that we see aggression in 2 directions. We see Russian aggression against Ukraine, but internally there is aggression too, in the form of corruption, in the form of oligarchs. We know that is a tool that the Kremlin itself uses and promotes in an attempt to corrode Ukraine from the inside. Victoria Nuland said recently, the #1 thing Ukraine needs to be in terms of being a strong, stable, and sovereign state is to tackle the endemic corruption problem. And the Biden administration has made clear its focus on supporting anti-corruption efforts because these efforts will help democracies thrive. And democracies, of course, are the best way we feel to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. It is a challenge between autocracy and democracy. And the concerns that we have about corruption, about rule of law are shared very much by Ukrainians and Americans. And the needs, I think, are very clear. The expectations of Ukrainians and Americans are clear. Reform efforts need to continue and need to deepen. This was very much Secretary Blinken's message in the very good conversations he had with President Zelensky and other officials in Kyiv. Let me take just a moment then to speak about the expectations of advancing our shared interests in Ukraine's reform agenda. The ambassador mentioned already the justice sector, and justice sector reform is absolutely essential. How Ukrainian authorities get out of the constitutional crisis created by the constitutional court's undermining and reversing of reforms is a real challenge for all Ukrainians. The United States as a partner is here and there in Kyiv to be supportive. We very much welcomed Ukraine's use of sanctions since February against pro-Russia actors who work to undermine Ukraine's reform progress and democratic institutions. This will help defend the reforms and move them forward and push back against the malign influences in a format under the rule of law. We have urged Ukraine to continue to take further steps to protect the institutions and to hold corrupt actors accountable. Any legislation that rolls back the independence of organizations, whether it's the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, or the central bank, does not help Ukraine. On the contrary, such legislation makes it difficult for international partners to continue their robust support. If it's not leading to the change in terms of Ukraine's needs, for example, corporate governance reform, including in the energy sector. It's been one of the signature reform initiatives taken on by the United States and international partners in Ukraine since 2014. President Biden knows this well from his work and engagement as vice president. The IMF, the EBRD, and other international financial institutions have coordinated closely on these reforms, and many in the international community, including here in the United States, were disappointed with the Cabinet of Ministers' April 28th decision and the machinations to remove the supervisory board of Naftogaz and replace the CEO. Secretary Blinken made that very clear. Ukraine's energy sector is one of the linchpins of its economy. Naftogaz is, of course, Ukraine's largest oil and gas company, and decisions taken appear inconsistent with the international standards of transparent corporate governance, including those adopted by the OECD. So the United States will look forward to working with Ukraine as its leadership acts expeditiously to restore and strengthen the trust with international partners, including the United States. That demonstration of commitment to respect for corporate governance and the standards that have been developed in terms of international standards tailored for Ukraine and its institutions are vitally important. I think all of us gathered here today can agree that good work is never finished. Just as we say in the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, we constantly keep at it, and certainly innovation and our work in the private sector as well reflects that. We believe strongly that necessary work continues. It's critical not to give in to backsliding. And that was the very positive message that Secretary Blinken delivered in Kyiv last week. Because we feel so strongly about Ukraine as a friend, we've asked Ukrainian leaders to recommit to implementing the economic and anti-corruption reforms that Ukraine needs to prosper and succeed. As good friends do, we will continue to stand ready to provide advice and support, and we are confident we can see positive movement, and this will be great for Ukraine, for the United States, for all of us, and for our partnership. So again, let me thank you for organizing this conference and giving me the honor of addressing you, and I wish you all the best for the ongoing sessions throughout the coming days. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Reeker. Having a little issue with my, oh, here we are. Thank you so very much for your very detailed report on your very, very timely visit to Ukraine. We appreciate all the comments you made about the various challenges that Ukraine is facing, and which this conference will be addressing in part. So again, thank you so much for taking time to join us and to give us this very important update. And so now I will turn the microphone to Robert McConnell, who is co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and who is the external coordinator for the initiative Friends of Ukraine Network, which is an initiative of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. Over to you, Robert McConnell.
Hello? Okay.
We hear you and we see you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Nadia. I found the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador, and Ambassador Reeker's comments very interesting and probably set us off on a good tack for today. Nadia introduced me. I'm co-founder of the foundation and work primarily with the foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network. First, I note, because some of you may have come on before the initial announcement, if you want to look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little globe, and you want to click on which language you want to hear this presentation in, English or Ukrainian. Once you click on that, you will be hearing clearly in the language of your choice. I am honored to be the moderator of this panel, 120 days into the Biden administration, status of U.S.-Ukraine relations. Our panel includes 4 members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network, and the full bios for each can be found by going to the conference landing page. But our panelists are Ambassador John Herbst, Director of the Eurasian Center at the Atlantic Council and a former ambassador to Ukraine; Deborah Kagan, Distinguished Energy Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense; Don Jensen, Director of Russia and Strategic Stability at the U.S. Institute for Peace; Dr. Phil Carver, the President of the Potomac Foundation; and Ambassador Vershbow, Sandy Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former Ambassador to the Russian Federation. We now are just under 120 days into the Biden presidency, and a lot has happened, and much has stayed the same. The new U.S. administration is getting its people in place, facing the global challenges, certainly including Putin's ongoing multi-dimensional war against Ukraine and the West. The U.S. has expressed support for Ukraine. Secretary Blinken, Undersecretary Nuland, and Ambassador Reeker were just in Kiev last week, and among other things, Secretary Blinken has indicated the U.S. is considering additional military support. As for staying the same, Ukraine's reform, or lack of it, continues to be an issue here and in Kiev. As always, Washington is expressing frustration with the pace of or lack of reform in Ukraine. And there seems to be, in many circles, a growing perception that President Zelensky feels he really doesn't have to be serious about reform because the U.S. and the West will not cut him or Ukraine off. Something else that continues is a pace and the same is Putin's ongoing multidimensional war. Most are aware of the military war, but 7 years after the Maidan, Ukraine is probably the best example of Russia's malign influence and disinformation. Because Don Jensen has been advised this morning that he must get to another meeting very shortly, First, I'm going to ask Don to talk about the disinformation aspect of Mr. Putin's war. Don?
Thank you, Bob. Can everybody hear me okay? Good morning. Good to see so many friends, colleagues, and baseball fans on the line. Bob, thanks especially to Bob and Nadia, friends and selfless supporters of Ukraine. And I think all of us express appreciation, more than appreciation, for all their work. Bob asked me to condense my remarks to 10 minutes, and I thought I would just give some observations about Ukraine, ambitious as it may seem, 7 years after the Maidan. And I wanted to lead particularly with what Bob said about Russia's disinformation successes. Ukraine, to me, remains, after all this time, after thousands of master's theses on various InfoWar topics, to me, it remains the poster child for a largely a successful Russian malign influence operation. Even today, 7 years after Maidan, you'll still see a lot of nonsense in the press in Europe, and frankly, even in the white-shod halls of the neighborhoods where a lot of us hang out in Washington. That there's a civil war ongoing, that the people, the fighters that the Russian support in the East, who are brigands really, are separatists, that Ukraine is an anti-Semitic state, the country is polarized by linguistic differences, polarized by religious antagonism, and a fascist state. Almost all of this is untrue. And the fact that so many people still talk about it suggests that none of us, Ukrainians, Americans, Europeans, are doing anywhere near enough to get the message out. Most of these accusations are demonstrably untrue. In the last couple of years, Russia's economy, for example, an obvious comparison, behaved far worse than grew far worse, if at all, compared to Ukraine. In corruption, Ukraine, as we all know, and I've already said this morning, has a serious, potentially fatal problem. The thing is, however, that Russia is more corrupt, according to Transparency International. We never hear that because the media, the discussion we have, tends to be one-sided, tends to have take de facto focus on the faults of our friends and less on the faults of our enemies. On the question of anti-Semitism, Pew Trust a year or two ago found that Ukraine, by comparison to all of its neighbors, including the big neighbor to the east, is less anti-Semitic, despite its tragic history, than a lot of the other countries in the region. However, we never hear about this. So again, I think there is much work we can all do to disseminate to rebut the false accusations people make about the processes going on there. And those are critical if we try to advance the reforms as Ambassador Reeker, Ambassador Markarova, Bob, Nadia, and everybody else talked about earlier this morning. Indeed, when I look at what has happened since the Revolution of Dignity, I actually see, and I'm rarely called Pollyannish, I actually see significant progress. Number one, I do not think for a second that the changes in the society, let's call them in the move away from Moscow, can be reversed at all. There will be steps forward, there will be steps backward, there will be steps sideways. But I don't think for a second that Putin's goal of having Ukraine return to some kind of provincial status in the Russian Federation is at all achievable, at least not without a cost so high even the Kremlin shies away from it. There are many examples of the country's democratic, I almost said reform, progress, not necessarily always toward the West, but certainly away from Moscow. If you look at popular opinion in Ukraine, every single poll from a variety of polling agencies since the middle of 2014 has Ukrainians in favor of NATO membership. Every single poll since the same time has Ukrainians in favor of joining the European Union. A Razumkov survey last month found 59% of Ukrainians want to join the European Union. Whether they can or whether they qualify is a different question. And that's the point of the event we're having this week. The National Institute for Strategic Studies and data published last month, 2 months ago, found that the number of civil society NGOs in Ukraine is far higher than it has been at any time in the past. These are very critical developments. I don't think we pay enough attention to them. And as I said a minute ago, and I also think that the pressure that this public opinion, the pressure that these organizations put on the government to change is absolutely critical and needs to be supported. Excuse me. At no point, however, do I want to argue that the problems are not serious, the problems are not severe. And we know all of them very well. First of all, I go back to my Richard Pipes training. The patrimonial nature of the regime is tough, so far extremely challenging nut to crack. The relationship between money and power, so common in all these post-Soviet systems, especially in Russia, also in Belarus and elsewhere. But in Ukraine, there is, as we said, the potential to break this link, and that means strengthening the courts, strengthening the rule of law. It's something which I personally support the efforts of the administration to strengthen that separation, but it's a long haul, as we all know. Second, and I have to be frank here, although the ambassador is present, I think in general, the Ukrainian political class, I almost said crass, which is also relevant. The Ukrainian political class has strongly underperformed. We have this incredible tension between the civil society, the society at large, which is moving away from a Soviet type mentality towards something more Western, towards something more Central European. And we have the political class, which just won't get off the dime or get off something else to make the reform and changes that need to be made. You're going to talk about a lot of this week, so I'm not going to get into greater detail. But let me conclude by saying, I hate to be America-centric, but I think two quotes are really relevant here. Number one is John Adams talking about the revolution and our revolution in a letter to his friend in 1818, talking about the revolution is in the hearts and minds of the people. And I strongly believe the revolution in Ukraine, at its core, has been in the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people. Despite all the differences, despite the differences between East and West and everything else Russian propaganda hits us with 24/7. The revolution has been in the hearts and minds of the people. But let me add the quote of another founding father, Benjamin Franklin. It is a democracy if we can keep it. Moving away from Moscow does not mean moving toward a democracy. It doesn't mean moving toward the EU, NATO, or Europe. It means undertaking successfully the kind of reforms that we've talked about. So it's yet to be seen whether the Ukrainian political class can keep the democracy they have, even if the revolution in most sectors of the society has already taken place. What I am convinced about, however, is that there is no going back. Whatever Ukraine ends up being in 5 or 10 or 15 years, whether it's a NATO member or EU member or not, there is no going back. Putin's yet to realize that, and that's the challenge of the moment to deal with that threat. But despite my mixed messages, I would say overall, I am, you have to be very careful here, hopeful that the country will continue to go in the right direction. Thank you for your time, Bob. I think I'm about at my 10-minute limit.
Don, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
It was asked a little earlier. Ambassador Markarova mentioned there's a very strong IT sector in Ukraine. Are you aware of any initiatives to coordinate efforts between the U.S. and Ukraine to develop partnerships in fighting and mitigating cybersecurity and disinformation attacks in that?
At an official level, I am not, Bob.
Okay.
And as we've seen in Russia, this area is not only a tool of malign Russian foreign policy, it is also a tool in Russia of control of the regime over the people. And it's Ukraine's vital IT sector that is part of that NGO, that broader society that keeps the country from slipping back too far, even if it cannot prevent stepping back sometimes.
Thank you very much, Don. I know that, as I mentioned,
You have to go. Great to see everybody, and I will try to tune back in a bit later.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now that Don is going to have to leave us, I do want to turn to our other panelists, and specifically, I want to start by asking Ambassador Herbst, John, how do you think the Biden administration is doing in engaging Ukraine and Russia in relation to Ukraine so far?
All right, I'd like to start with an anecdote, if you don't mind, Bob.
Sure.
Phil Reeker, I think, very well put it that the United States is determined to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And that's absolutely right. And this means that Ukraine will not have to participate in such farces as the hockey match took place in Sochi yesterday, involving legends of Russian hockey. And we know that Russians play very high caliber hockey. And in the match, President Putin scored 8 goals. 8 goals in his team's victory, 13-9. So he scored almost 3 hat tricks in that one game. And I think, one of the good things about our policy is that if it succeeds, and it will, Ukraine will not have to play in the next hockey match that President Putin scores 8 or more goals in. And that's one way to look at the current problem, the current geopolitical problem facing the country. I give Biden and his team pretty high marks thus far for its policy towards Ukraine and Russia. Biden has a very clear view that Mr. Putin is pursuing a revanchist foreign policy. He wants to upend the security structure established in Europe, you might say after the end of World War II, but then reinforced by the Helsinki Accords in the late 70s, and then, of course, the post-Cold War changes in the early 90s. And Putin's assault on Ukraine, as his previous assault on Georgia, is designed to undermine the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of these two nations, not just these two nations. Biden understands that our strong support for Ukraine is not because we love Ukrainians, although we do. It's because our interest, American national interests, are at stake. If Putin succeeds with his war in Donbass, you can be sure he'll be taking increasingly provocative measures vis-a-vis our NATO allies in the Baltic region. So we need to stop Putin in Donbass. We need to make sure Ukraine has the means, the wherewithal to stop Putin in Donbass. And we've seen this, I think, to my mind, in a gratifying way, as Putin built up his forces along Ukraine's eastern border with Russia, as Putin built up his forces in northern Crimea, so that he can exert pressure and perhaps launch an escalation in Moscow's ongoing war on Ukraine. We watched the little green men take Crimea 7 years ago. We watched the start of the hybrid war in Donbass 7 years ago. And we watched in horror as the West was largely silent. Well, Biden and his team were not silent. We had an extraordinary week of telephone diplomacy in which Biden, Blinken, Austin, Sullivan, and Milley all called their Ukrainian counterparts and said we were going to stand by Ukraine. To make sure that Moscow got the message, Milley called General Gerasimov in Moscow and told him the same thing. And we saw, we sent signals in the form of sanctions against the Kremlin, in the form of talk of military assistance, that we were not going to stand by if Moscow upped the ante in Ukraine. Now, I give the Biden administration high marks for that, although they don't get an A. They made some mistakes. The most obvious was the announcement that 2 American destroyers were heading to the Black Sea, and then they were turned around. And to make it worse, the decision to turn around came after Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, said that, those destroyers may wish they didn't get there. That was a mistake. Now, this was actually not just a 2-step, it was a 3-step, because we subsequently agreed to send a Coast Guard cutter. But we should never have turned around those destroyers. And the Brits are also sending destroyers. But that was a mistake. A second mistake, and I'm very frustrated about this, is the Biden's unwillingness to lower the boom on firms that have renewed construction on Nord Stream 2. Congress passed sanctions. Those sanctions should be applied. We have to make sure Nord Stream 2 is stopped. And I understand the Biden administration's reasoning. They don't want to upset the Germans. I agree. I prefer not to upset the Germans, except when American national interests are at stake. And they're at stake here. The Germans need to be upset. Well, we need to upset them. But we need to stop that project. Last point. Some people, some of my friends and fellow workers in the field have criticized the administration for Biden's reach out to Putin for a summit. I don't agree with that criticism. We should be talking to the Russians, as long as our talking points are the right one. And Biden has indicated, again, he has a very clear-eyed view of Putin's malicious intent. So I have no doubt that when Biden and Putin meet, Biden will say the right things. And if our words are the right ones and our actions are the right ones, it makes sense to talk to Moscow. Thank you.
John,
by the way, I should congratulate President Putin on his superb performance. 8 goals in 1 game is really something else.
John, I do have a follow-up.
Please.
You gave the administration, and I don't disagree, positive marks going forward. But we talk about our strategic partnership and how close it is. How does that match with the fact that we have had a vacancy in our ambassador to Ukraine for a very long time, and the Biden administration hasn't even put forward a name yet?
I think this is unfortunate. I think this speaks far more to American political processes than to the state of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. I don't need to repeat for this audience the problems, even the scandals, in President Trump's policy towards Ukraine. I say President Trump's policy as opposed to the Trump administration's policy, which was actually pretty good. We know that the Trump administration had a candidate in the queue, General Dayton, Keith Dayton, who's a very smart guy who would have been excellent. And we also know that, when President Biden won the election, when candidate Biden won the election, the Democrats decided they wanted their own ambassador. And as a former State Department official, I know how long it takes to send a new ambassador out. It's a many months long process, bordering on a year. So it's, again, the thought processes, the political practices of the American political class, which explains the absence of an ambassador in Kyiv. And that's unfortunate. But we have an excellent charge there, Christina Kvin. She's doing a good job, very good job. As Phil Reeker made clear, and as the week of American telephone diplomacy made clear, Ukraine is receiving quality attention at senior levels in Washington. So like you, I regret the absence of a strong American ambassador. I am confident the Biden administration will get one out there, but it's probably not going to be until the fall. And in fact, I'd be happy if we got that ambassador there in September. It'll more likely be at the end of the year rather than early in September.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. It came up obviously in Ambassador Reeker's comments. Clearly, the Biden administration, as the others before it, is not happy with reform efforts or lack of them in Ukraine. Is there something Kiev is missing about the message we're sending? Deborah?
I was just trying to unmute, I'm sorry. Yes, first I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this august panel today. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciated hearing the opening remarks. I think Ukraine is making some strategic errors, and among those is there is an assumption that US patience is endless. And I think they've concluded this because, as Ambassador Reeker said from his first visit with President Clinton back in 1995, we have been at it with Ukraine for a very long time. Many of the people on this panel have spent enormous amounts of time in Ukraine trying to change the dynamic. And I think that it's important that those of us who've been engaged with Ukraine for many, many decades, we seem to be going through the same machinations about corruption and bad business practices that we had discussions about 25 years ago. And that's never a good thing. That's not something you want to do. And while the changes that we've seen, particularly in the energy sector, might give short-term wealth and import to a few people, they also have the same, the reaction that they do for the rest of the country is they're hollowing out Ukraine from inside. It is almost as if it's bad enough you have Russia sitting there and occupying part of Ukraine, threatening Ukrainians and killing them every day. But then you go ahead and you hollow out the country from the inside by granting great things for a handful of people and undermining, demoralizing, upending, and destroying the confidence of the young people who Ukraine needs to move forward in this century. So the first thing I would say is I implore the leaders of Ukraine not to sell down the country's future for political favors, because what happens if young people get disenfranchised, they'll leave, or they simply won't be part of this future. Ukraine has, as we've heard from other speakers, a huge amount of technology training, great education, can bring to bear a lot of excellence in this field. But if your young people don't think that they're going to be part of the solution, then why should they invest the time and energy and instead just leave and move elsewhere? Which is what's happened in places like Hungary. The amount of people who have left since it's become more of an illiberal democracy is pretty significant. Croatia was dealing with the same problems before they had a shift and change of government. So Ukraine should not be setting itself up to lose its intellectual, its business, all of its acumen that it needs to progress into this century by giving a couple of short-term favors to some very avaricious people who believe that short-term wealth is the way to run a country. So I'll say that first. The second thing I want to say, and I want to build on what the other speakers have said, and what John has mentioned, which is Russia's activities in Ukraine have always been about so much more than Ukraine. So on the one hand, I'm sitting here and I'm talking about what Ukraine needs to do internally. And now I want to talk about the Biden administration and about Western Europe and about what NATO and the EU do here. Us understanding that Russia's goals with its energy policy is to control a huge part of Europe, as I like to say, from the Baltics to the Balkans, with both Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream, is critically important. This is not, as so many have described Nord Stream 2, as just a tiff with Germany and only refers to Ukraine. That undersells and totally underestimates what Russia's intentions are. And this administration, as John has said, has disappointed me incredibly so on this issue. Alliances are not built on a single issue. And it is ridiculous to assume that the relationship with Germany, which, by the way, is undergoing a huge election campaign, and it may not even have the same party in charge And it's likely there'll be, as the French like to say, a cohabitation government. This may be a government that mixes the Greens with others. So putting all your eggs in a basket just to keep friends with a handful of Germans who might not be in power in a couple of months is ridiculous. It's palpably ridiculous. And this single issue will not make or break German relations. And I think this is something we really have to say very loud and clear. To not mention Nord Stream 2, to not mention the deleterious effect that Nord Stream 2 will have, not just on Ukraine, but on the rest of Europe, is ridiculous. And I'll say one other thing. You cannot sit here and hold a climate conference and talk about the evils of US hydrocarbon industry, of oil and gas in the United States, and all the economic and climate evils that they perpetuate, and then give a wink and a nod and allow Russia to go ahead and sell almost 70%, export almost 70% of all of its hydrocarbons to Europe and say that's okay. In other words, US industry should get shut down, but it's okay for Russia to continue underwriting Vladimir Putin's campaigns of revanchism throughout Europe and the Middle East. And so I think it's time for this administration to take a stand, a consistent stand, and say, this is not okay, this has got to stop, but not just because of Ukraine, but because of the long-term deleterious effects it will have on that entire continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm sure we'll get back to a few of those issues, but at the moment, I'd like to turn to Sandy. Many in Washington and Europe had issues with President Trump's approach to NATO, and of course, NATO is a factor in dealing with the military situation, at least the military situation in Ukraine. Sandy, what do you observe in this relationship as the Biden team gets underway?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much to you and Nadia for the chance to speak on this panel. It's very good timing for this conference. I think it's well understood that Biden has made restoring the strength of our alliances and NATO above all other alliances as the foundation of the administration's approach to the great power competition, both with China and with an aggressive Russia. And I think this is good news for Ukraine because a unified NATO firmly committed to defending against Russian aggression, standing up for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity is definitely a good partner for Ukraine to have. And I think, as John Herbst said, Biden is quite determined to defend the international rules-based order that we've relied upon since World War II in a way that President Trump was not. Now, the alliance itself emerged a bit battered and bruised from 4 years of Trump, but it survived in one piece. Despite Trump's bullying and his threats, the allies generally stayed on track in all the work that was launched after the invasion of Ukraine to rebuild NATO's defense and deterrence posture. So Biden actually starts with a fairly good inheritance from the Trump administration on the nuts and bolts of NATO, even though it will take some time to fully restore allies' trust and confidence in US leadership. And even the NATO-Ukraine partnership also emerged in pretty good shape as well, despite the scandals surrounding the famous phone call and the events that led to impeachment. Ukraine demonstrated continued progress on defense reforms, wrote a new highly praised national security strategy, increased its cooperation with NATO on cyber defense, on Black Sea security, and it even contributed to the COVID response with Ukrainian transport planes delivering COVID-related assistance. So I think it's important that this is a two-way street. The allies have learned a lot from Ukraine's experience in confronting Russian conventional and hybrid warfare. There was one unexpected bit of good news last year, which was NATO's agreement in June 2020 to grant Ukraine the so-called EOP status, Enhanced Opportunities Partner status. It's almost a year since it happened, and it's still not entirely clear what new activities will result from it, but I think it is giving impetus to work on strengthening interoperability and expanding political consultations between NATO and Ukraine. Now that's all the sort of good news. I think, unfortunately, from Ukraine's point of view, nothing much has changed either under Trump or so far under the Biden administration when it comes to the very specific issue of Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership. It's of course been 13 years since NATO promised in Bucharest that Ukraine and also Georgia will someday become members of the alliance, but the issue remains still quite static, and the alliance is far from unified on this issue. President Zelensky wasn't wrong when he said a few months ago that Ukraine will never be fully secure until it actually joins NATO and has the protection of an Article 5 guarantee. And it's understandable that he's been pushing for the first procedural step toward membership, membership action plan. And he's even hoping that this will be announced at the June NATO summit. But the reality, however, is less optimistic for that. And it's because, frankly, Ukraine isn't quite ready for NATO membership, and NATO isn't quite ready for Ukraine either. From NATO's vantage point, Ukraine has a lot of work to do to fully flesh out its defense reforms, to become fully interoperable with NATO forces, to bring its armed forces and procedures into alignment with NATO standards. And perhaps more importantly, the NATO allies, like the US, is still waiting for Ukraine to get truly serious about the fight against corruption and about making its judicial and other domestic reforms irreversible. As Secretary Blinken said in Kiev, defeating the enemy within, the enemy of corruption, is as important as stopping the Russian aggressors in Donbass and in Crimea. And frankly, allies agree with the assessment that the last year has been a disappointing one, a case of one step forward, two steps back, despite the high hopes for the Zelensky government. Now, beyond these factors, it's no secret that allies are still very skittish about the Russian reaction to any near-term moves on NATO membership for Ukraine, despite repeating the 2008 promise at every high-level meeting. I think that for now, the administration has decided that it would be counterproductive and highly divisive to have a debate inside NATO on membership at this time. But I do hope, and I hope this conference will give some impetus to that, that the administration will support other steps to deepen NATO's relationship with Ukraine, short of an Article 5 guarantee, and look for a lot of different ways that they could increase Ukraine's practical cooperation with the alliance. This could even include NATO establishing a continuous military presence at Ukrainian training centers or naval installations. It could include what's going to be the subject of the next panel, the adoption of an integrated strategy for defense and deterrence in the Black Sea region that would allow for the full participation of Ukraine and Georgia. And perhaps more daringly, as part of the ongoing review in NATO on the strategic concept of the alliance and defining NATO's future role in the year 2030, that NATO will step up and begin to think seriously about how to take forward Ukrainian membership, how to extend an Article 5 security guarantee to a country that has such long borders with Russia. It's not an easy task. And in short, stop marking time and begin to move forward with Ukrainian membership. A strong Ukraine that's capable of defending itself and is governed by the rule of law would be a good candidate for NATO membership and make it hard for NATO to postpone this issue any longer. We're not there yet, but I'm hoping that the Biden administration will lean a bit more forward than its predecessors on the issue of Ukrainian membership, if not this year, then during the life of its first 4-year term. Thanks very much.
Sandy,
I mean, I think you kind of referenced this, but President Zelensky and others seem to, in some of their statements, when they are talking about membership action plan, NATO membership and so forth, at least to me, I wonder, do they really grasp what they need to do? That it's not just getting a vote from NATO, that they need to do things before they're ready for NATO membership. Do you think they've really grasped those responsibilities?
I think they grasp it, but like on other areas, as others pointed out, they may think that they can get away with a B+ or C performance, or a gentleman's C, and not follow through on the full scope of the concrete requirements for NATO membership. And I think they don't fully understand that the broader issue of domestic reforms is also going to be part of the criteria that NATO uses. It's not just about military interoperability. It's also about democracy, rule of law, fighting corruption. In short, being a country that is demonstrating not only in word, but in deed that it's committed to the shared values that underpin NATO. We've seen some countries backslide on those values, including Hungary, and to some degree Poland and Turkey. So NATO is not going to want to admit new allies that also are wobbly on these basic values issues. So I think they understand, they talk the talk, but they don't always act as if they fully get it, that we're not going to lower the bar for Ukraine when the issue of membership is finally on the active agenda.
Thank you. I think there are several things to come back to later, but before we do that, as mentioned, I think I mentioned it, and it's certainly been in the news, Secretary Blinken has made the point that the U.S. is considering additional military support for Ukraine. Phil Carver, you are in touch with military advisors here, with the general staff in Ukraine, as well as having, certainly among this group, being the only one that has visited the front lines in Donbass. What are your thoughts about additional military aid to Ukraine?
Thanks, and I'll address that. By the way, just as a prelude, I may contradict or disagree a little bit with some of my colleagues, but in general, don't take that as a disagreeing strategically. I think one thing that tends to get forgotten, and particularly in this recent buildup where the Russians were building up along the Ukrainian border, all of a sudden there's a new Russian threat. What's happened is we've basically ignored one of the largest buildups of military power since the end of the Cold War. Russia has added the following forces opposite Ukraine that didn't exist there before: the 1st Guards Tank Army, the 20th Guards Army, 3rd Shock Army, 22nd Corps in Crimea, the 1st and 2nd Donetsk Corps, which were part separatists, but also officer and supplied and part manned by the Russians. To give you an idea, that's 128 mechanized infantry and tank battalions that didn't exist 7 years ago, okay? 50 battalions of artillery. That's roughly 4,000 armored vehicles and more than 1,000 tubes of artillery. And what is our response been? We spent less than 100 Javelin missile launchers. We spent 24 counter battery radars, some of which have been lost. We sent some light Jeeps, only a portion of which were armored and most of which were in such a dilapidated condition they could only use for spare parts. We've done some training, but we kept the training back at low level. Our response to that military threat is absolutely pathetic. Now, the reason I stress that, and in terms of this recent, so why all of a sudden with that as an extant force, why were we so concerned about the mobilization? Well, the Russians were bringing in command and control for high-level maneuvers. They were bringing in their latest electronic warfare and taking out surveillance UAVs, knocking them out of the sky with electronic warfare. They brought in battleships or ships from both the North Sea and the Baltic to reinforce, and the Caspian Sea. They were practicing all kinds of maneuvers. This is a process that's going to go on for the next 6-7 months. Why? Because the Russians have announced that with the effort to reintegrate the Belarusian military in with the Russian military, they're going to have a big exercise called Zapad West 2021. And in the process, this is a whole series of exercises that's going to be building up all summer long with forces deployed. This isn't a one-time thing. You know, Americans tend to be a bit narcissistic. We go, oh, this is all about whether we call somebody a murderer or not. No, these plans and exercises were announced in December and January, and they're going to continue all summer long. By late August, it's going to be really interesting in the area because there's going to be a lot of military activity. Now, so what got brought forward were things that were the kinds of preparations you would do if you were going to launch an offensive. Additional logistics. I counted over 100 videos of different videos of truck transports and rail reinforcements. In terms of maneuver forces, they brought in something like 17 to 20 maneuver battalions and another maybe 10 artillery battalions and some nuclear capable missiles. But it wasn't that force that's the tipping point. The extant threat is there. Now, so that's my first point. And I think to the extent that we ignore that, we ignore how minimal our military support has been. And we also ignore what needs to be done. Second point, I just really disagree with those who find it that Ukraine is not militarily ready for NATO membership. The forces that they have built and are in place and trained today, half of which have combat experience, are larger than the last 10 NATO members, countries to join NATO combined. Ukraine, if you walk through the NATO new NATO members in Eastern Europe and put a checklist together of who's converted to NATO standards, Ukraine is better than most, and yet we let the others in. I think that's a shibboleth. I think the real reason is that people, particularly the Germans, complain, well, we don't want Ukraine as part of NATO because they have a territorial dispute, which is one of the great hypocrisies of all time. Germany joined NATO when they were divided. If the same rule that would apply to Ukraine is applied to them, there'd still be East Germany. Why is that important? Because both for NATO and for us, and here again, I think my third point, I think we tend to focus on what we do for Ukraine. But flip it around. What does Ukraine do for us? So that Ukrainian army today is in the way of any Russian moves against Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova, with Russia reintegrating or attempting to reintegrate Belarus and have an offensive potential against Poland and the Baltics, something they practiced fairly routinely. And if they do reintegrate the Belarusian army, and it's going to be a much more significant threat. Ukraine offers a very substantial worry for them having Ukraine on that side. So Ukraine counterbalances a lot of the Russian potential malevolence in Central and Eastern Europe. Those are forces that we don't have to man. Those 200,000 active troops and another 100,000 that can be mobilized in the reserves are not American boys who are going to have to die for Eastern Europe. Now we can all say, oh, well, we don't want to get involved anymore. But just remember, World War I started in Eastern Europe. World War II started in Eastern Europe. If a conflict goes on in Eastern Europe, particularly against NATO members, you know that we're going to be involved. Why wouldn't we want that force on our side? My fourth point, just about a week ago, Foreign Minister Lazarov said, had a lecture for the Ukrainians. And he said, don't depend on the Americans. They are not going to be with you militarily. They talk the talk, but they are not on your side militarily. Now, it was Deborah said, well, our patience isn't endless. But I also think the pro-Western mood in Ukraine is not endless. They wanted to be part of the West. That was what McDonnell was about. Oh, well, you're not ready for a EU membership. Oh, well, you're not ready for a NATO. The more the Russians put pressure on them, and the more obvious the impotence of any military response that we have, sends a really tough message. And eventually, they can't afford to keep their army counter-mobilized against the Russians year in, year out. They cannot afford modern Western technology as Russians are modernizing their own without help. Well, eventually, they're going to be gone. And my argument is we're going to miss them when they are. Lastly, a bit of contention on reform. At the height, a couple of weeks ago, at the height of the Russian pressure on Ukraine, all of a sudden the Ukrainian railroads stopped running. Why? Because the company that supplied the fuel oil for the diesel engines suddenly ran out. It happened to be a Russian-owned company. How did they get the bid? Oh, they were the lowest bidder in the reform movement. So sometimes this reform liturgy is misplaced. There's very few countries that can be in a 7-year-long war. War and corruption tend to kind of go along together. And so this argument, oh, well, we have a two-front problem, we got to solve it. Yes, you do. But I would point out that the term lobbyist and corruption originated in Washington, D.C. at the Willard Hotel during the Civil War. When countries are in a wartime environment, you have to make some tough decisions, you have to make tough allocations, and a lot of stuff goes on. How do we end this thing? I don't think we end it with more sanctions. Tom Schelling, a professor of mine, used to say, the most effective coercion is not the threat already done, but the threat that's to come. Sanctions, in a way, are always after the horse has gone out of the barn. They shoot something, and when we sanction, okay. Quite clearly, for all the sanctions that have gone on, and by the way, they tend to be a ragtag grouping. That most of the sanctions aren't particularly organized or strategic. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But in any case, it's like threatening to take the lunch money away from a bully. All it does is give you a hungry bully. The Russians are playing their instrument of currency in the current politics of Eastern Europe is military force. Not necessarily its use, but it's extant or in being capability. And unless we address that and recognize it for what it is, and then counter it with help to the Ukrainians, I think we will reach a point where Ukrainian sustainability is not endless.
Thank you, Phil. Look, obviously for those viewers, the Friends of Ukraine network, all of the members, all of the people on this panel are members of that, have a divergent, have different views, but strongly held views, all of which are supportive in U.S. supportive of Ukraine. Let me ask a question, and Phil can be the first at it, but I'd like to hear from others. It's a combination of things. U.S. policy towards Ukraine has this big element of fix your corruption. Do we have that same priority in dealing with other countries that we have concerns about? And I'm going to tie this to if or when will Putin make another military move? Phil, you can start, but I'd like to hear from others.
Well, as I said, I think I'd buckle my seatbelt and get ready for a very interesting summer. Zapad is supposed to climax in 2 weeks in September, and between now and then, I think we're going to see all kinds of stuff going on. The problem is, by the way, when that happens and they bring forces up and they get their comm ready and the logistics are there, you're in the Chicken Little phenomenon. If you warn that an attack is imminent and it doesn't happen, then everybody goes back to sleep. But they can play that like a Stradivarius, and I think it's going to grow and continue to grow over the next 6 months. In terms of corruption. By the way, I'd like to say that even though my background is as a Republican, I have a very positive view of what the Biden administration has done so far. I agree with everybody's assessment. Considering where they are and what hit them early in the administration before a lot of people are in place, I'd also like to reinforce that I think it's tragic that somebody with a military capability, military understanding, sending another foreign service officer who doesn't understand military capability to Kiev, I believe is a mistake. You need somebody like a Keith Dayton. And by the way, it's a double loss because he was also in charge of the NATO advisory group, which now is leaderless. And so we have the two most influential roles in Ukraine, ambassador and head of the advisory group, empty at a time of a quasi-military crisis and I believe a budding one that's going to be going on all summer. Why we do this to ourselves is beyond me. But even worse, who the hell are we to lecture them on corruption when you look at what's happened from both administrations, whether it's Prodigy going there and making big consulting money, or the Giuliani mess, or American policy in Ukraine has been, in terms of what we do and what we say, is an absolute embarrassment. We got to walk around with a bag on our head. I find it ludicrous that we with a straight face go in and start lecturing them on corruption. Is there corruption there? Yes. By the way, I've seen corruption because I spent a lot of time there, 108 days at the front. I have not seen it in the operating military. I have seen it in the logistics side, and I've seen it definitely on the R&D and the equipment procurement side. Some of which gets listed as corruption, by the way, isn't. For example, Ukraine has a very robust and in many ways a very good, getting antiquated, but a very sound military industrial complex. That complex was designed since Ukrainian independence as a mechanism for income for the country, not for supplying its own forces. So they price their equipment for the international market, as opposed to what you would get for your own guys. Ukroboron prom, I used to call it porn, because it's a pornographic that they're sitting there worrying about making money and their own kids are dying. But that system is set up. They actually pay more in taxes than they get in orders from the Ukrainian military. Why? Because they're pricing and designing their equipment for foreign sales. So is that corruption? Well, it's a mechanism of state income. I personally think that it ought to change, and it's kind of hard to ask for outside help with a straight face when they can't get their own act together in terms of them supplying some of their own equipment. But it isn't corruption in the sense that some oligarch is making lots of money out of the deal. Certainly, it's open for Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts in terms of foreign military sales. But as a general rule, that the design of that is not fulfilling their national need. So yes, they ought to change that. the biggest issue that they're going to face is that they have a decent army, and that army can acquit itself, I think, quite well. They don't have an air force. And within the next 5 years, the airframes of those aircraft, they've done all they can to fix them. You cannot fight and have the hope of holding on in a modern conflict when the other side dominates the air. And there's no way Ukraine is going to be able to afford a whole new generation of modern aircraft. And I say that at a time when we're taking and putting A-10 ground attack aircraft that we've already bought and paid for with flight hours out into the desert because we don't have the force structure. The same with F-16s. The same with our strike aircraft, F-15Es. And you go, wait a minute. What good does our stuff do sitting out in the desert? Because we don't have the manpower and end strength. They have and oh, by the way, if you want to offset Russian pressure in the Baltic, Ukrainian air bases are the place that you want to do it. So there's a natural thing there, I call it lend-lease, but basically we loan them aircraft and they allow us to use their bases. I think there's a lot of things that we got creative and strategic about it that we could do. I realize that's your next panel and I've gone on too long. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Phil. You've certainly put a lot on the table here. I do want to note that maybe some of you others, while we've been on here, have seen this. A little thing went across my screen. This relates to corruption. That I think there were two, but Medvedchuk was one of them. Has been charged with treason today in Ukraine. Having thrown that little tidbit in there, if anybody knows more about it. But Phil has discussed both the corruption issue and whether we're going to see more action coming forth from the Russians over the summer. I think I want to hear from everybody on that. I'll start with John.
Okay, first let me talk about corruption or about reform in Ukraine. I think Phil has one point here, which is important, that we have to be careful in the way we talk about reform. And it is true that, there are instances of corruption in our own country, even instances of corruption in connection with US policy towards Ukraine, President Trump's personal policy towards Ukraine. But we shouldn't therefore say we have no stake in promoting reform in Ukraine. We have an absolutely critical stake. And it's not just for the sake of Ukraine, it's our own geopolitical interests. Arguably the most important and extraordinary thing that happened globally right at the end of the Cold War was the concerted movement of many former members of the Warsaw Pact in the direction of democracy, open society, and, as it turns out, becoming part of the European community, both the EU and NATO. And that was only possible because they undertook massive transformation from a corrupt and I'd actually say immoral socialist system to a free-based society. Unfortunately, Ukraine has not mirrored that achievement of Poland, of the Baltic states, of the Czech Republic, and so on. And that has been at great cost to Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, but also to Ukraine's geopolitical position, and for that matter, the geopolitical position of Europe. A corrupt Ukraine mired in the old ways of running a country is a Ukraine susceptible to manipulation by the Kremlin. It is as large or nearly as large a threat as Moscow's troops. And sadly, the serious reform we've seen in Ukraine since the Maidan Revolution was only possible because of strong advocacy from the West, the EU, the United States, the EBRD, the IMF, and so on. That is the real scandal, the scandal of Ukraine's political class. Bob, you just mentioned the news about Medvedchuk being accused of treason. That's the first I've heard it. I won't comment on that so much as on the step that Zelensky took a few weeks ago, or maybe a month or two ago, to take away the Medvedchuk-controlled television stations. It was a scandal that Zelensky's predecessor was in a business relationship with Medvedchuk. And that we all know that Medvedchuk was perhaps the principal vehicle among Ukrainian political figures of Kremlin interests in the country, Kremlin interest and influence. So it's a sad fact that Ukraine has needed a strong Western role to undertake the reforms that Ukraine needs for its own reasons and for the well-being of its citizens. So that's the reform question. And it's clear, as you mentioned in your comments, Bob, that President Zelensky needs help too in promoting reform. And I think Biden's just the guy who can help with it. Now, on the Russian danger. The Russian danger is substantial, but it should also not be exaggerated. Obviously, the Russian military can do whatever it wants within Ukraine. It can seize any point it wants. There is some question, and Phil could talk about this thing better than I, whether Russia could retain, can control the areas they take. While Moscow has the ability to do that, I mean, again, to seize anything it wants, it recognizes that if it pursued a regular conventional war out there in the open, so even Russian propaganda and disinformation cannot confuse those who want to be confused, the impact on their policy, on their relations with the West would be catastrophic. I think then you might really be talking about the use of SWIFT sanctions. SWIFT, the financial system, not SWIFT as in fast sanctions, that could really cripple the Russian economy. So I don't think Moscow is going to move in that direction. But I think it's absolutely critical that the West be vigilant, as it was in this last episode, as Moscow begins to threaten to escalate. Because the West offers a determined response before the fact, there's a good chance Putin will not move. But this requires, again, vigilance and nimbleness. And perhaps most of all, and I'm glad to say we have the person to do it now, American leadership. Because as we saw, again, in this latest incident, the initial comments coming out of Berlin and Paris were frankly weak, even laughable. And only after some encouragement from Washington did they begin to talk about the fact that this is a Moscow provocation, as opposed to an incident where both sides need to show restraint. I hope I wasn't ambiguous in my response.
Well, Sandy, you have some comments? And Deborah, I'm coming to you next. Sandy, you're muted.
Thanks very much. I agree with what John just said. Sorry. And clearly a half-hearted approach to corruption by Ukraine just makes them vulnerable to Russian interference and meddling, whether it's through crooked business connections or propaganda. And so without denying that we have a lot of repairing to do to our own reputation, as do many of our allies, for Ukraine, this is an absolute necessity. And the fact that some of the most progressive reformist members of the initial cabinet of Zelensky were sacked a year ago, and people associated with Yanukovych are coming back, that even the new energy minister is connected with identified Russian spy, Mr. Derkach, suggests that there's still a tug of war going on inside Ukraine, and it needs to be resolved by the president in favor of a clear and unequivocal commitment to reform and anti-corruption. Now, on the Russian threat, I don't want to go on too long, but I think it's probably right to assume that Putin never intended to actually launch military aggression based on this recent buildup, because he does worry about much more stringent sanctions and doesn't want to risk casualties, which the Russian people are definitely opposed to, and it would make it harder to keep this thin veneer of plausible deniability that there are no Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. But that being said, we can't completely rule it out, even though Putin has seen some of his maximum goals thwarted by the Ukrainians, including the whole Novorossiya project. It doesn't mean he's changed his ultimate goals for Ukraine, and just being able to ratchet up the pressure at times of his own choosing, mobilizing troops, pulling them back, mobilizing them again, but leaving in place the blockade of the Black Sea and of the Kerch Strait. suggests that he's trying to keep Ukraine perpetually off balance and show Ukraine that the West is not going to be able to save Ukraine from these kind of Russian machinations. So I think even as we push the Ukrainians to address corruption and get their own house in order, our strategy has to be based on further strengthening Ukraine's ability to protect itself. If we're not ready to fight for them, and we can't just snap our fingers and bring them into NATO, then we have to do everything possible for them to protect themselves. And I think this has thus far been mainly a US effort with a little help from Canada and a few other allies. But I think we should make this a NATO priority, press other allies to join the effort to equip and train Ukrainian forces, to provide them with the kinds of systems, including more coastal defense, air defense, others can name the hardware better than I, so that the Russians won't even be tempted to actually use force again. This is about deterrence at the end of the day. The Ukrainians have fought to a kind of very fragile standoff thus far, but it could collapse. The Russians could grab the North Crimean water canal. They could put peacekeepers into Donbass, a lot of scenarios. We need to make the Ukrainians strong enough that Russia wouldn't even dare to do these things, both because of the Ukrainian capability and the certainty of a unified US, EU, NATO response when it comes to sanctions. So that should be our priority, and we should make this a collective NATO effort, not just a US effort.
Deborah?
Thank you. A couple of things. One, I just want to jump into what Sandy just said on the deterrence issue. I think, and I know that I sound like I don't do anything else, but if the United States cannot even implement new sanctions on Nord Stream 2, why should the Russians believe that the US would do anything that would be even more costly in terms of countermeasures against a Russian threat, a military threat? So I just want to put that out there, that in the context of deterrence, if you're a Russian, if you're Vladimir Putin and you're looking at this from their narrative, what they're saying to the Ukrainian people and other people in that region, like Moldova, Belarus, is that, boy, the US won't even take an action against Nord Stream 2. So why do you think they're going to come racing to your defense over something like masses of Russian forces on your border, or opening up a new Western military district in Belarus, or, you know, putting 300 nuclear advisors in Hungary with a new nuclear plant, etc. So I just put that out there. I agree with what Sandy said, but deterrence is not only a military piece. Deterrence is fits in a broad range of everything from economics to political actions and the like. And again, if you can't even take a step on Nord Stream 2, why would you, Putin saying to these other countries, think that the US or anyone else is going to come to your rescue on infinitely harder and more pernicious issues? The second point I'll make is that it is not the US lecturing Ukraine about corruption, even though that's how it sounds. It doesn't really matter what the US says or does. The fact is, you're not going to get the investment you need, the companies that want to come in that actually have to play by rule of law because of their own national laws. Unless you want Ukraine's economy to be dominated by countries like China, who, whose initiatives basically are, we'll give you all this free money up front, but when the bill comes due, it's like, if you don't pay, we're going to kneecap you. Their expression is, we'll just take over this port. We'll just take over this city. And that's what they did in places from Ethiopia to Greece. And so if you want to have the right kind of investment, if you want to have a successful economy for people and a future for them, This is your issue. This is not us lecturing you. This is Ukraine making decisions that will have an effect on the Ukrainian economy going beyond the next 2 years. And the last point is, the world's newest democracies are the most fragile. When NATO enlarged and the European Union enlarged, I don't know that everyone involved in this understood that these democracies were tenuous, that they were going to be buffeted as much as they have been. Sandy mentioned Poland as well. We talked about Hungary, we talk about Turkey. New democracies don't just last because you get up one day, you vote and say, I have a new democracy. We're talking in the annals of history, 20, 25 years is not a lot of time. And so Ukraine's success, or whether it backslides into some sort of illiberal model, really depends on getting this right as much as possible. And in terms of holding Ukraine's feet to the fire more than other countries, a friend of mine, a NATO diplomat, once said to me when NATO started to enlarge, what would happen if we forced all the other members to recompete? Because some of what had gone on in some of those countries would now make them not as eligible, I think, for enlargement as they were back in the 90s, for example. So I just say that this isn't us hectoring Ukraine to do the right thing. This is you moving that forward, so you're not caught in this abyss right now that Albania and North Macedonia are in terms of EU membership, for example. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Deborah. You brought up, I don't think you're the only one, but in the context of corruption, we are talking in many aspects about business and investment and so forth. I want to point out that this conference, this 3-day conference, the first morning deals with U.S.-Ukraine relations, and then the next panel with General Breedlove and the others talks about security in the Black Sea. But it strikes me, and I believe this is an absolute truism, that if Ukraine cleans up its rule of law, all the other things, and gets the corruption problem fixed, the business, Western business, inclinations to get further involved and entangled, that could be the biggest security strengthening Ukraine could feel, because when you have all the business interests and ties and commercial interests involved, the United States government, the other governments, have a greater and greater interest in the security of Ukraine. Having said that, we have a couple of questions. One from the audience is for all the panelists, but I'm preferably or initially for Phil. How can Turkey play a critical role as the second strongest NATO member to influence the situation in Donbass? Or how can the alliance be strengthened to create an impact in the Black Sea region? This is something that we're going to be discussing on the next panel, but Phil? You're muted, Phil.
Prior to the attempted coup in Turkey, there have been growing stronger relations between Ukraine military and Turkish military. The Turkish attitude is mixed, I think. So on the one hand, they're buying Russian S-400 air defense missiles, which have the potential of being integrated in with the Russian air defense system, and gives, if that happens, gives the Russians essentially insight to the Eastern Med that they don't have now in terms of tracking our aircraft and our aircraft carriers. They're also, because we then turned around and cut off their access to the F-35, they're now looking at the Russian fighter. So there's a part of Turkey is this kind of strong autonomy of them wanting to do their own thing and not be tied as to our military assistance and what comes with it. On the other hand, they have a very strong commitment to the Tartars in Crimea. And it's really Crimea that draws the Turkish interest there. And they have gone over backwards, in my view, of trying to be supportive of that and Ukraine in terms of Ukraine's sovereignty, and also trying to offset some of the Russian naval power in the Black Sea. So the Turkish issue is mixed. I think we should recognize the positives, but there's a couple of warning signs out on the horizon in terms of how deeply they become dependent on Russian technology and all that comes with that. The best way to realign the military imbalance in the Black Sea, and it's significant, is with air power, and that means a constant air capability in the region. Ukraine has about a dozen underused air bases, and like I said, a pathetic air force that took some heavy losses during the in 2014 that haven't been replaced, and they can't afford modernization. So if you want to offset naval strength, do it from the air or land-based missiles. You know, you can take a page out of the Chinese copybook. You know, they've driven our aircraft carriers 1,000 kilometers away from China with the DF-21 missile. Ukraine has been working on a similar missile. Our army wants to build a missile, but the IOC on it is still a decade away. So, you know, it kind of be sort of interesting if we did a joint missile development with the Ukrainians. But in any case, if you want to control the Black Sea, it essentially is Ukraine territory. And by the way, that also works to the north in terms of offsetting Russian influence in Belarus and the threat to Poland and the Baltic. So Ukraine is a strategic position, and the key to their survival is what happens with a future Air Force. One point about that, I think that by the way, I didn't mean to imply that I didn't think reform is important. I just think that it has been overemphasized relative to what the security challenge and what we need, and why it's in our interest to help the security challenge. I think I would not be at all adverse to saying to Ukraine, all right, we'll help you build a new Air Force. We'll help you get a modern Air Force. But here's the quid pro quo on reform. I have no problem with that. But just handing out little tiny pieces, you know, blankets, MREs, begging Putin to take an off-ramp, which he seems oblivious to, and then turning around and lecturing them on reform. I think it's been a lot of talk, a lot of hot air, and relatively little military assistance. And I think you need to reverse it. Carry a big stick, talk softly. Negotiate with the Russians. I think we and the Brits, because we were the partners in an infamous Budapest agreement, we ought to be at the table, not France and Germany, in the discussions with about the future of Ukraine with Russia, because the three of us made an implicit agreement for them to get rid of their nukes. And it might be we almost have a moral obligation to be there and leading that delegation. But one last comment, because Deborah raised a thing I think is really important about the Nord Stream. Once Nord Stream is there, it's going to be very hard to enforce sanctions with the people who are dependent on it, on that energy in the West. So once they get onto the end of that energy hose, the threat of having their economy shut down by that being cut off is going to be very real.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to note one other question and then go to a lightning round, given our time, and final comments. And if you want to comment on this question that's been asked from the audience. On May 5th, a group of German lawyers filed a case against Lukashenko from Belarus for crimes against humanity to the prosecution office in Germany. If that case were to go forward, would it be appropriate to try Vladimir Putin for crimes against humanity? And I will add to that an interest from some in Ukraine's government to have the two quote unquote separatist republics in the East declared to be terrorist organizations. For the lightning round, if you want to take any of that or not, first, John.
I think it's simply, I understand why people might want to bring charges of war crimes against Putin. I think it's simply unrealistic. And I think there are too many real challenges we have in pushing for strong American policy against Kremlin revisionism and in support of Ukraine to go down that rabbit hole. Now, the second question was about what again, please?
There's some interest in Kiev to get the United States of the West to declare the.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. The
separatists. I would look at that very, very carefully. At this point, I don't have an opinion. I would try and figure out what would be the impact on the overall situation, one, on the ground, and two, on maintaining strong support or sufficient support in Europe as Kyiv deals with the Kremlin provocations. But I think it's something that might make sense. But I'm not endorsing it. I think we need to study it.
But for the lightning round, your final comments.
Final comments. I am encouraged by what's going on right now in our relationship with Ukraine, and to a lesser extent, but still by what's going on in Ukraine itself. I think the Biden administration's focus on the country and American interests there is going to resuscitate the reform impulse that does exist in Ukraine. So I think we're going to see a tightening of the relationship on security matters, not quite as tight as Phil and I would like it, but still tighter. And I think we'll see better quality attention coming from Bankova on reform issues with some encouragement from the White House.
Thank you.
And key members of State Department, including a specific undersecretary.
Thank you. I'll go in the order we started off with. Deborah?
Thanks. Very quickly, I agree with John. Extrajudicial indictments are usually they're just not worth the paper they're written on. I've lost count on how many times different governments and countries have wanted to try U.S. Members of U.S. administrations in absentia. It's rather ridiculous. And so it may look good on paper, but it does not bear out well in reality. My final comments are this, that this is not a way to tell Ukraine how to run its nation. But what Ukraine does will have very significant consequences about what other countries and what other businesses will do vis-a-vis Ukraine. And that is the lifeblood of that country. So I would get away from this view that, oh, you're just lecturing us, and move ahead more toward that. It's great that you have military reform and your military is doing the right thing. And, you know, under the heavy burden of war, militaries tend to reform faster than the other parts of society. That's rather inevitable. But let's look at the bigger picture here and forget about having your feelings hurt about who's getting lectured, and instead do things that are right for the long-term investment of the stability of your country. And finally, I would worry a lot less about getting MAP for NATO right now. I would worry a lot more on moving toward doing the sorts of things that you would do that would make you a better ally in the long run. But stop telling the people of Ukraine and stop having this discussion about how we're going to get MAP and someone's promised us this, because we know that there are countries in NATO who have tried to block virtually every other country coming into the alliance, and they're going to continue to do that. And those governments will change over time too. But when there is a readiness to have this discussion, Ukraine ought to be ready to present its bona fides that show that it's ready for that. But I would stop making these promises that, oh, this is what we're going to get, and this is what every visit of the US government means for us, because you're creating a false narrative that Russia will inevitably exploit.
Thank you, Deborah. Sandy?
Thanks. Agree with Deborah's last point. Ukrainians shouldn't promise something that is not going to be delivered, certainly not in the near term. And anyway, MAP is not absolutely necessary to do the necessary preparations that would make Ukraine a more attractive and capable candidate for NATO membership when the political winds begin to blow in a more favorable direction on that. And I think that depends on whether the Biden administration is going to step up to the question of, are we ever going to deliver on the 2008 promise? There's a lot we can do for Ukraine now. A lot more we could be doing for Ukraine now. But ultimately, it's going to take US leadership, if not this year, then next year or the one after, to actually begin to move towards bringing Ukraine in. On the question about Turkey, I'd just say that Turkey has been kind of an uneven and unreliable partner on Ukraine from the start. They've never applied the EU sanctions, unlike a lot of other non-EU allies. And of course, they are playing footsie with the Russians with the S-400 and kind of competing, cooperating from one day to the next. You can't tell what it is in Libya and Syria. I think the Biden administration has an opportunity, despite the difficulty of dealing with Mr. Erdogan, to see whether we can pull Turkey into a more positive role on Ukraine. Certainly they're the key to a much more substantial NATO strategy and presence in the Black Sea region. And maybe we can find a way to defuse the issue of the S-400 by finding more productive areas where Turkey can contribute to the alliance. Finally, as John said, I think the overall approach the Biden administration is taking is quite solid, and I think that it has the potential to win broad allied support. I think this idea of having a two-track approach, pushing back harder against Russian aggression, but keeping the door open for dialogue, is a way of keeping allies on side and stabilizing the relationship, which does have serious risks. I think the approach to sanctions has sounded very improved and strategic, but Nord Stream 2, I agree with Deborah, is kind of a blind spot. I had assumed that within a few weeks, they would have looked for the Germans to provide some sort of consensual solution, so we didn't have to force them to close it. But that time has now passed, and something needs to happen before the pipeline becomes operational in the next few months. But Deborah's right that this is kind of a blind spot in what is otherwise looking like a very productive and effective strategy that might, at least in time, begin to change Russian behavior, enable us to get a just political settlement in Donbass rather than one that the Russians are trying to impose on Ukraine right now, and begin the painstaking process of bringing Russia back into compliance with the international law and the rules-based order. Clearly providing more leverage is not just about sanctions, it's about strengthening Ukraine. And I think, I hope we can do more of that with our NATO allies, as well as on a bilateral basis.
Thank you. Phil, we're a little over our time, but you have a final comment?
So quickly on the terrorist issue, I think if you look, Russia about 3 or 4 months ago is now allowing the people in the Donbass and in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas to vote in Russian parliamentary elections, which is looks like a process in which they're going to be become adopted or incorporated into Russia. So if they want to change the status quo ante, then or just change the things, then I don't see any reason why. Certainly, the leadership and the actions in both those two areas qualify for terrorism by any definition. So if the Russians want to incorporate those areas, I don't see what's wrong with us having it recognized that they're incorporating two terrorist states or quasi-states that they, satraps that they put up. Strategically, what bothers me, and I'm not optimistic, but hopeful. I think if any administration could do it, this one could, is America getting a strategic vision of understanding that what Ukraine does for us, as opposed to just what we're doing for Ukraine. And when we do, then act on it. And the interesting thing is, it's a relatively, by helping them with their Air Force modernization, it's it not only is relatively cheap because we've already bought the airplanes and we're not using them. The geography is perfect because it helps offset what else is going on in the region. And I think it does send and can be tied to a very direct set of guidelines on issues of reform, not the least of which is Ukrainian defense industry. So to me, that strategy could put together a very synergistic effect that meets a number of concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I may be wrong, but I think I did not finish a complete thought when I was talking about business ties to Ukraine. I mentioned that these first two panels have to do with U.S.-Ukraine relations and the Baltic Black Sea. The rest of the three-day panel conference has to do with business connections and so forth, going straight to the whole question of business relations, the innovation in Ukraine, the benefits that we can get through business ties and corporate ties with Ukraine, and the benefits that Ukraine can get from that. I also want to add in closing, beside thanking our panelists for taking the time, for being here, and for their thoughts, that the Friends of Ukraine Network have over the last years always come up with priority recommendations for U.S. assistance to Ukraine. This is the book from 2020. The National Security Task Force recommendations, priority recommendations, will be completed and be starting to be distributed to our government and elsewhere by the end of this week. With that, I thank you all. I thank the listeners, and I note that the next panel is on the Black Sea. Whose is it? It's got an excellent panel, and I hope that you will log in for that one. Thank you all, and goodbye.